If you challenge my story in front of my guests again, I will have you fired by noon." The billionaire hissed, his voice a low and vicious threat that dripped with the arrogance of absolute power. The quiet museum guide's only crime had been to correct a wealthy donor's self-aggrandizing lie about a famous battle. But that billionaire, a man who believed money could buy anything, including history, didn't know he was threatening a man who had actually lived that history, and that the museum's new director was the very officer who had awarded him the medal for his valor on that day. Arthur Vance moved through the vast, echoing marble halls of the National War Museum like a ghost. At 72, with the quiet stoicism of a man who had seen too much of the world's noise, he was the lead tour guide, a position he cherished with a fierce, protective love. To the thousands of tourists who passed through each year, their faces illuminated by the glow of their phones, he was just a kind, knowledgeable old man in a neat navy blue blazer, someone who could tell you the precise caliber of a Civil War rifle or the date of a forgotten treaty. He was part of the exhibit, as silent and steadfast as the glass cases he so meticulously polished each morning. This profound silence was his hard-won peace, his sanctuary from the clamor of a world he no longer recognized, and from the deafening echoes of a past he could never truly forget. Before he was a guide, he had been Captain Arthur Vance, a decorated infantry officer and a respected historian with the U.S. Army. He hadn't just studied history in dusty archives. He had carved his name into its violent pages during one of the most brutal and decisive battles of the modern era. He had returned home with a silver star on his chest, a slight limp in his right leg, and a profound, unshakable understanding that the real stories of war are written not in the grand headlines of newspapers, but in the quiet courage and desperate sacrifices of ordinary men. He took the job at the museum to be a guardian of their truth, to ensure that the real history, the one paid for in blood, sweat, and tears, would never be rewritten by those who had not earned the right to tell it. His quiet, orderly world was about to be invaded by the very thing he despised: manufactured truth. The museum was in the midst of a massive fundraising campaign, and its most coveted prize was a colossal donation from Edward Pierce, a ruthless tech billionaire with a colossal ego and a freshly discovered passion for military history. Pierce had recently donated a famous dramatic painting of the Battle of Three Rivers, a massive canvas that now served as the centerpiece of the museum's main hall. He hadn't donated it out of patriotism, but as a monument to himself, a way to etch his own name alongside the heroes he so superficially admired. In exchange for his generosity, he received a seat on the museum's board and the fawning, sycophantic admiration of the museum's current director, a weak-willed man named Mr. Davies, who was terrified of losing the billionaire's promised 8-figure funding. One Tuesday afternoon, Pierce was leading a private tour for a group of potential investors, using the magnificent painting as his personal stage. Arthur was assigned to accompany the group, officially to be on hand for any technical questions, but in reality to serve as a silent, validating prop for Pierce's performance. Pierce stood before the grand canvas, a dramatic and somewhat romanticized depiction of smoke, fire, and heroism. "As you can see, gentlemen," Pierce began, his voice booming with unearned authority, "this was the turning point of the entire campaign. My personal research indicates that the central figure, the one you see rallying the men with the flag, was a young lieutenant who single-handedly took out 3 enemy machine gun positions." He paused for dramatic effect, letting his words sink in. It was a moment of pure individual genius that won the day. A testament to singular leadership. The investors nodded, impressed by his supposed expertise, but Arthur felt a cold, familiar fury rise within him, a feeling he hadn't experienced since he was on the battlefield. Pierce's story was a complete and utter fabrication, a Hollywood fantasy designed to appeal to the simple narratives that men like him preferred. The battle had been won not by a single act of genius, but by the dogged, terrifying, and collective grit of an entire platoon that refused to break. And the lieutenant in the painting wasn't even an officer. He was a young medic, a boy of 19 named O'Connell, who had died while shielding his wounded sergeant from mortar fire. Pierce was not just wrong. He was actively erasing the memory of a true, selfless hero to tell a better, more marketable story. Arthur remained silent, his hands clenched into tight fists in his pockets, his solemn duty to the truth warring with his simple duty as an employee. He could let it slide. He could keep his job. He could allow this lie to hang in the air, to calcify into accepted fact. But then Pierce went one step further, a step of such staggering arrogance that it shattered Arthur's composure. "I often imagine myself in that moment," he said, with a smug, self-satisfied smile, making that same decisive charge. That was it. That was the line. Arthur could no longer remain silent. "But you won't believe this." He took a single, quiet step forward, his polished shoes making no sound on the marble floor. "Excuse me, Mr. Pierce," he said, his voice soft but clear, cutting through the billionaire's monologue like a surgeon's scalpel. "But that is incorrect." The room went utterly silent. The investors turned to look at him. Pierce spun around, his eyes narrowing, his face a mask of shocked disbelief that a mere guide, a uniformed servant, would dare to interrupt him. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. Arthur stood his ground, his gaze as steady and unwavering as it had been under enemy fire. The man in the center of that painting was not a lieutenant. He was a medic, Private First Class O'Connell. He wasn't charging. He was shielding a wounded man from mortar fire. He died on that spot. The battle wasn't won by one man, sir. It was won by the 30 men of Bravo Company who held that line for 7 brutal hours. I know this because I was there. The humiliation on Pierce's face was instantaneous and ugly. He had been exposed as a fraud, a pretentious buffoon, in front of the very people he was trying to impress. His face turned a deep, blotchy red. After the tour group had awkwardly dispersed, their hushed whispers echoing in the hall, Pierce cornered Arthur and the trembling director, Mr. Davies. That's when he delivered his vicious threat. "If you ever challenge my story in front of my guests again, I will have you fired by noon. I own this exhibit, and I will own the story that goes with it." Later that day, Davies, a man with a spine made of jelly, called Arthur into his office. "Arthur, you know how much we need Mr. Pierce's funding," he pleaded, avoiding Arthur's gaze. "He's demanding a public apology and your immediate termination." Arthur simply looked at him, his expression one of profound pity. "I will not apologize for telling the truth." And so he was fired. He quietly packed a few personal items from his locker, a faded photo of his platoon, a small worn Bible, and walked out of the museum, his sanctuary now a place of dishonor. He hadn't seen the biggest surprise yet. The next morning, a decorated Army colonel in his full-dress uniform arrived at the museum. He introduced himself to the receptionist as Colonel Miller, the museum's newly appointed executive director, arriving a week ahead of schedule. His first order of business, he said, was to meet the lead tour guide, a man named Arthur Vance. Mr. Davies was summoned, his face pale with dread. "Colonel, a pleasure," he said, forcing a weak smile. "Welcome." As for Mr. Vance, regrettably, his employment was terminated yesterday due to a conflict with one of our major donors. And it was at this exact moment that everything changed. Colonel Miller's friendly demeanor vanished, replaced by an authority that seemed to suck the air out of the room. "A conflict? Is that what you call it when a man of honor defends the truth against the lies of a man of wealth?" He took a step closer to Davies. "I read the incident report. Mr. Pierce, a man who has never spent a day in uniform, tried to lecture a man who spent 20 years in it. Let me tell you who you just fired." The colonel's voice dropped to a low, powerful tone that resonated with history. "You didn't just fire a guide. You fired Captain Arthur Vance, retired. The Army's foremost historian on that campaign, and, more importantly, the recipient of the Silver Star for his actions at the Battle of Three Rivers. He was the acting commander of Bravo Company on that day. He held that line. The medic who died, the one in that painting? He was Captain Vance's radio man. He died in his arms." Davies looked as if he was about to collapse. The colonel wasn't finished. "I know this, Mr. Davies, because I was the young lieutenant who served under him, and I was the officer who pinned that medal on his chest myself. Arthur Vance is a living legend, and you fired him to appease a man who thinks history is something you can buy. At that precise moment, Edward Pierce himself strode into the office, ready to gloat over his victory. He stopped dead in his tracks when he saw the colonel. The colonel turned to him. "Mr. Pierce, your generous donation is appreciated, but your narrative is not. This museum is a testament to sacrifice, not a stage for your ego. As my first act as director, I am reinstating Captain Vance, not as a guide, but as this museum's first ever chief historical consultant. His job will be to ensure that every story we tell here is the truth, the whole truth." He then looked at Pierce with eyes like cold steel. "And your seat on the board? Consider it under review." Pierce, for the first time in his life, was utterly speechless. His money was powerless against a currency he could never possess, earned honor. Arthur was brought back not as an employee, but as a guardian. He spent his days ensuring that the stories of heroes like P.F.C. O'Connell were told with the accuracy and dignity they deserved. His quiet voice, once again the most powerful force in the halls of history. Kindness and merit are recorded even when they go unnoticed. To continue hearing stories that prove it, don't forget to follow the Merit Ledger and leave a comment about a time when a small act of kindness made a huge difference. Because every life is a record worth reading.